Okay, so it seems like it's heading up on Facebook now. So today we get to talk about one of our favorite scholars from Jewish history, and that is, of course, without a doubt, we must be talking about. We would be talking about who's one of the great scholars.
Rabbi Akiva?
Who's that?
Rabbi Akiva?
No, not Rabbi Akiva, but it's close. There's lots of
Maimonides.
No. Okay. No, he is one of those great ones, but it's not one that I would expect to. But he's got lots of similarities to Rabbi Akiva. His name is Hillel.
Hillel.
Okay, so let me show you what we're going to say from Hillel today. Whoops. There you go. All right. Okay. So let's look over here. Hillel, right? We all know about Hillel. We've all heard something about the great man named Hillel. What's the most famous story of Hillel? Hillel has one of the most famous Talmudic stories that you don't even have to have learned much Mishna and Talmud. Probably the most famous story from all of Talmud is the story of Hillel.
Teach me the Torah on 1 foot.
There you go. Interestingly enough, that story happened to him, at least him and Hillel and Shammai. It happened to them at least twice. The most famous one is the one where he says that the Torah is teaching the whole Torah, but it happened to him other times. Similar stories with converts. He has all types of really cool stories. If we have time, we'll get into some of the other ones, which are less known. So today we talk about we're up to the last of the pairs. If you could recall, we're going through this time called the pairs, the zugot, and there was 5 zugot in Jewish history, 5 pairs that kind of shared the Jewish leadership. The last of those pairs was Hillel and Shammai. Hillel was, of course, the Nasi. He was the leader, and Shammai was the Av Beth Din. Now, Shammai was a very different type of person. They each had their own schools. They each learned quite differently. But Hillel was most famous for, first of all, in his rulings. In the rulings in his school, you saw that the teachings were generally much more lenient than Shammai's, which it's an interesting idea that you see that, the greater, sometimes to be able to give leniencies, it requires someone to be greater. We've spoken about that in the past. Hillel also, he's always known to find the softest and kind of creative ways of how to do things. Just like the story of don't do unto others what you don't like done to yourself. That's a great story. That's a typical Hillel type of style, where he always finds a nice way of telling people what he wants to say. To give you another example of this, I want to tell you one of the other stories of Hillel. Hillel was once again approached by somebody. Hey, Sam, welcome. Hillel was once approached by another convert wanting to convert. And this convert said to him, I want to learn from you the Torah. But he wants to know first, how many Torahs do you believe in? So just like the other story, he first went and he asked this question to Shammai, and Shammai said, well, there's the Torah and there's the oral interpretation that was given to God by Moses, which we call the Torah Shebaal Peh. Well, he says, well, I don't believe in that. I don't want to know about that. So I want to learn the Torah and I want to convert to Judaism without having known the rabbinical traditions, the oral Torah. Okay, Shammai says, well, I'm sorry, that's just not possible. You can't learn the Torah in such a way.
Talking to me.
Then the convert goes to what's his name? To Hillel. And when he comes to Hillel, what does he say? He says the same thing. I want to learn how many Torahs do you believe in? He says, I believe in 2 Torahs. I believe that is the Torah. And the oral interpretations known as the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah given over by Moses. So he says, well, I don't want to hear that Torah. I don't believe in it. It's a famous Christian idea, by the way. A lot of religions that claim to believe in the Old Testament, they basically just don't like our interpretation of it, so they want to make their own interpretation of it. Anyway, so Hillel says, okay, fine, no problem. So he says, you see, that's the difference. In Shammai, it's like, this is the way it is, and that's it. Now, Shammai is a very straight shooter. Hillel says, sorry. Hillel says, no problem, we'll do it your way. We won't learn the oral Torah. So he says, but before we learn the Torah, we've got to learn the Aleph Beis, the alphabet. So, okay, let's sit down. They sit down and they teach them the alphabet. And day 1, they learn Aleph. Day 2, they learn Beit. And day 3, they learn Gimel. And by the time he comes to the next day and they've gone through the whole alphabet, they come back and they want to revise. So what happens? Hillel points to Aleph and he says, oh, you see that letter? That's a tough. Then he points to the bet and he says, you see that letter? That's a shin. And, the guy's like, well, hold on a second. You told me yesterday that was an Aleph. Now you're telling me it's a tough. He says, I don't understand. How do you know if it's a tough or an Aleph? You don't know. The only reason why you know that it's an Aleph or a tough is because I'm telling you. So he says, the way I'm telling you is because we've gotten a tradition all the way back to Moses that this is an Aleph and that's a bet. So if you trust me that an Aleph is a bet, you can also trust me on the meaning of the words of the Torah and the oral Torah. And that's how he convinced the person that it was impossible to study the Torah without having the oral interpretation. Okay? Which is a famous argument that has allowed us to have all these answers throughout time. So that's just a way of understanding Hillel's approach. He always finds a way to get people to understand, to appreciate, even though they're not holding by it. And that's really the approach that he's going to be teaching today. Don't force people to fit into a particular channel. Make it a way that you could bring the Torah, make the Torah available to them. But also you're going to see a very important rule that he teaches. He says you never change the Torah. Never change the Torah, which was a big concept. We're going to see. Let's go back onto our screen and see what he actually teaches now. So look at the words. Hillel and Shammai received from them. Who were their teachers? Their teachers were the converts, Shmaya and Avtalion, that we spoke about over the last couple of weeks. So Hillel and Shammai were their disciples. Now, Hillel would say, what did he say? Be of the disciples of Aharon. Who was Aaron? Moshe's brother. What was Aaron famous for? Hevei mitamidav shalav, ohev shalom, a lover of peace. That's an important thing. Some of the people, we like peace, but are you a lover of peace? That's a different statement. Some people, it's like Aaron was famous that he almost lived for peace the whole time. V'rodev shalom, don't just love it, but chase after it. Find ways to make peace in every single circumstance. Okay? Now, the next thing that he says, by the way, we're going to have quite a few statements from Hillel. He's one of the most quoted people in all of Pirkei Avot, almost in all of Ethics of Our Fathers. He's one of the most quoted. But then he says, Ohevet habriot, we want you to love the creatures, umukarvan la Torah, and bring them closer to the Torah, and draw them close to the Torah. Now let's unpack this statement over here. What was the way of Aaron that he wants us to be the disciples of Aaron? What did Aaron do that was so unique? What Aaron did that was unique is that he went out of his way to find ways to make peace. He lived for it. He chased for it. It was like his life's goal. It became a statement afterwards of people for all time saying that Kohanim are people of peace. If a person has had big fights or faribbles, whatever we call them, in South Africa we call them faribbles, if you've been involved in too many arguments, there was a Kohen. Is it questionable whether that Kohen is allowed to go up on the holidays to do the Birkat Kohanim, to do the priestly blessing? Why? Because a Kohen is a Ish Chesed. He's supposed to be a man of kindness, a man of love. That's what a Kohen is supposed to be. Where did that start from? That start from Aaron. How do we know this? If you look in the Torah, we're told that two people in the Torah were mournful for 30 days. Who were those two people? There was Moshe right at the end of the Torah and Aaron. Aaron was also mournful for 30 days. But not only that, when it came to Aaron, it says, Kol Beis Israel, the entire Jewish people. That what that's including is both men and women. Every single Jew mourned for 30 days for the passing of Aaron. And he wasn't even the leader. He was kind of like the second in command. He was the high priest. However, when it comes to Moshe, it tells us that who mourned for Moshe for 30 days? It was all the men. Which, what does that mean? It tells us that Moshe was all about the teaching. He was the leader. He was the teaching. He was the guide. He never necessarily had so much to do with all the people. That he obviously did, and everybody was definitely more affected by Moshe than Aaron. But with direct connection, on a day-to-day basis, Aaron had more connection. Aaron would go from family to family and finding out where there's issues, where people are not getting along, and he would try to find a way to make peace. And this is where we come into our topic about lying. Aaron taught a certain principle, which was this. He says that there's nothing greater than peace. Nothing greater than people getting along. Now, you can't hear me? Could you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I can hear me. So Aaron teaches that there's nothing greater than peace and people getting along. Now, the question is, Moshe was all about truth. They can hear me. Mishka, my wife is saying that other people can't hear me. She's lost her connection. Okay. Moshe was all about truth. What was Moshe? Moshe was the man of the Torah. What's the Torah? The Torah is the truth of the world, the Torah of God, right? Torah Moshe, it's called. Moshe is the teacher of the Torah. He's everything about truth. He is not able in his position to ever say anything that's even the slightest of a lie. Aaron is in a different position. Aaron's in a position where at times he has to say something which could appear to be a non-truth. What does that mean? What he would do is he would, so to speak, do what we appear to be a lie, but in a sense would be a truth. What was the case? He would go from family to family and find out if there was, for example, a husband and wife that weren't getting along, and he would talk to them individually and convince them that the other one really loves them and really wants to forgive. Now, this may not have been the truth that he knew this, but he knew that often most of the times when people got into a fight, it's because they believed that the other one had stopped wanting to have a connection with them. The other one was no longer interested in being in a good relationship to them. Or if he found two business partners that had things had gone sour, what he would do is he would go to the business partners, he would take them aside and say that this man, let's say it's Yankel and Shmerel, he would go to Shmerel and he'd say, Shmerel, you should know that Yankel told me that he really wants to make peace. Then he would go to Yankel and he'd say that Yankel, you should know that Shmerel told me he really wants to make peace. And through that, what would happen? Or that he would say, this would never necessarily happen, but he would say it in a way that would convince the other person that the other person really wants peace. Now, if you would ask him, is he lying? He would say no, because he says, I believe this to be the truth. I believe that people really want truth. It's just what happens, the ego gets in the way. And I'm helping people get over their ego. I'm helping them get beyond those issues. But Moshe would never do such a thing. Because unless he could be 100% certain that this was the truth, he could not say such a thing. It's interesting because there's a certain statement at the end of the Torah that seems to imply that Moshe says that even though Aaron's approach was something I could never do, at the end of the day, Aaron's approach is good. In other words, it gets to a greater truth. The greater truth is that people and couples most of the time really do want to get along. They really do want peace. It's just that other things have gotten in the way. So this is the way of Aharon. Why did even every single Jew fast mourned the passing of Aaron because his characteristics were such that everything about him was about the way of peace. He doesn't say be like the students of Moshe. Of course, we know that we're all the students of Moshe, but he's trying to bring out the trait that Aaron had. He was all about finding ways to bring peace between different peoples. Okay, that's the thing about Aaron. Oev Shalom v'rodev Shalom. Before I go on, does anybody have any questions on what I've said so far?
No questions, thanks, Rabbi.
Okay,
No.
let's go. Oh, okay, let's go on a little bit. I'm going to go back to the thing. I want to tell you a few things about Hillel, about who he was, and why we hold him in such great regard. Not just because of the story where he says, "Don't do unto others if you don't like what done to ourselves," but because somebody said, I asked, we're going to be talking about a very famous character. And people, I think, Mark, I think you said Rabbi Akiva. Now, it's interesting that there's lots of comparisons between Hillel and Rabbi Akiva. The two most blatant, I could think of three great similarities, or maybe four great similarities between Rabbi Akiva and Hillel. Number one, Rabbi Akiva only starts learning Torah at the age of 40. Hillel, I don't know if he only starts learning Torah at the age of 40, but he came from a very wealthy family, and at the age of 40, he leaves his home and all his wealth behind, and he goes to be able to support himself and to study. Now, we don't know the same tradition like Rabbi Akiva, that he was an absolute ignoramus beforehand, but we know that he certainly was not the great Hillel until the age 40. That's when he started really taking things seriously. That's number one. Number two is both of them are recorded to have lived to the age of 120, which was the same age as, we say 120. There's few people that we know to have lived to that exact age. The most famous of that was Moshe. Second most famous of that was Rabbi Akiva, and the third most famous is Hillel. Third comparison between Rabbi Akiva and Hillel is that there's the most famous statement of Rabbi Akiva is love your fellow as your the statement that you should love your fellow as yourself. What does Rabbi Akiva say about that? Is klal gadol b'Torah. This is the great principle of the Torah. What's the most famous principle lesson that we know of Hillel? He says, "Don't do unto others." Is when the convert asks him to tell them the whole Torah while he's standing on one foot, he says, what does he say? He says, "Don't do unto others what you don't like done to yourself." In other words, be good to your fellow friend. And the rest is commentary. That's the entire Torah, he says. Obviously, it's not that it's the entire Torah, but he says the rest is all helping you bring to such a level that you have true love of your fellow as yourself. All the mitzvot of Shabbat and Tefillin and the Chagim, all that is all connected. So we see these three great interesting ideas, and particularly their teachings, that were very similar. We also know that they both had many, many students. So those were when you said that it was Rabbi Akiva, it was interesting to see that these are two men that have lots of similarities between them. Now, famously, Hillel was when he would study in the time, he would go and study by the teachers of the time was Shema and Avtalion, right? The people of the two previous teachings that we taught. And the way they would support and take care of the electricity bills or the candle bills, whatever you called it in those days, the gas and the heat, they would take a coin as a fee to come into the Bet Medrash, to come into the house of study every day. And that's how they would cover their costs. Now, Hillel became, from being an extremely wealthy person, when he left to study, he lost all his wealth, he gave it all up, and he became an absolute pauper. And he would survive of collecting wood for people so that they could have fire. The one day, and then he would take whatever money he had. He would give half of the money that he earned would be able to cover the cost of his entry fee into the house of study. And he would work just to be able to cover the bare minimum. But one day he never had the fee. So the guard at the door didn't allow him to enter. So what did he do? He was desperate to hear the Torah, the Shira being given. He didn't want to miss it out. So he climbed up onto the roof, and there was a hole in the roof, like a skylight, where he thought he would be able to hear the shiur. Anyway, he got so engrossed in the shiur, before he knew it, it started snowing, and he didn't realize he was totally oblivious to his surroundings. And the snow piled on top of him. And the reason why they figured out that he was there, the way that he survived, is because the skylight got covered up. And they wondered, why was the skylight covered up? And they went to check. They had lost all their light. And somebody went up to check and to uncover the skylight, and they found Hillel buried in the snow, unconscious. And they asked him, what is he doing? He told them he was desperate to hear the shiur, but he never had the money to enter the Beth Midrash. So he listened from outside. He never realized. And he went unconscious from the freeze. And his teachers, Shmai and Naphtali, and the leaders of the time, they said that, first of all, they abolished the rule that people that can't afford shouldn't have to pay. And what does it show? A person that really wants to study should find a way. And that's probably when fundraisers started for every yeshiva started getting a fundraiser to cover costs for people that couldn't afford. So they said another statement that Hillel is making trouble for the poor people. The poor people always had an excuse that they're working too hard, that they can't afford, they just can't afford to come. But Hillel has now shown that even if you can't afford, you can find a way. If there's a will, there's a way. So they said you've made trouble for the people that actually can't afford. So that was one of the other great stories. Now, one of the things we knew about Hillel, and this is all part of this concept of his understanding where Hillel was coming from, one of his statements is that you have to have great humility and love. We know that when you're humble, you don't take yourself too seriously. Thanks, Noah. So he said that there was once, Hillel, when he was really the leader of the Jewish people, he became famous as the most humble and patient person. Nobody that was told that the word around him was that nobody could ever get Hillel to get angry. They could never anger him. It just wasn't possible. So these two men, they had a debate. The one man said, I bet you that I can get Hillel angry. And they managed to pledge a huge sum of money, there was 400 zuz, which was like an exorbitant amount of money in those days. And he said, I bet you I'll get Hillel angry. What happened? He, excuse me. He went the busiest time of the week just before Shabbos, when of course he knew that he was extremely busy, and he was busy having his bath. And he went to Hillel's house, and he started screaming, is this Hillel's house or this Hillel's house? And then Hillel came out, covered himself, and he started asking him a bunch of ludicrous questions about like why, and the Talmud actually tells us some of these questions. Why is it that the Africans have flat feet? Why is it that, and then they were just totally random questions. It was acting as though desperate for the answer. It was just totally random questions that were meaningless. Why is it that, that Asians have narrow eyes, the Talmud that he was asking? And why is it? And Hillel sat there and explained these things to him. And after he finished asking these questions, Hillel would say, is that all? Is there anything else that you want to ask? And he says, no, that's okay, thank you. And then he went back to his bathhouse, and just as sure that he had just got back undressed, he would call, "Is this Hillel's house? Is this Hillel's house?" just to disturb him. And Hillel would patiently come out again, and he would ask him a bunch of other ridiculous questions, random questions that make no sense. And this would go on, and he did it for a long time, basically not allowing Hillel to get anything done. But he was sure that he would get Hillel to lose his cool. Hillel never lost his cool. So he got really angry because he said, Hillel said, "Why are you so angry?" He says, because of you, I lost 400 zuz. So he said, "Why is that?" He told him, "I'd made a bet that I'd be able to get you angry, and I was unsuccessful." So Hillel replies, he says, "You should rather lose 400 zuz and another 400 zuz and another 400 zuz, more and more money, but never lose your temper and never get angry." In other words, no money is worth the person getting angry. That was Hillel's incredible personality and way about him. I'll tell you a few more important points about Hillel, about the statement. One of the famous things that Hillel instituted was something called the Pruzbul. Now, what was the Pruzbul? The Pruzbul was, there's a law in Torah that on the seventh year, so there's 7-year cycles, right? And the seventh year, you have to make the land rest. Now, there's a law that if you've lent money to somebody, the Torah says that if it comes the seventh year, any money that you owe people fall away, are erased. So that's the law. Now, the problem with this law is that many people, when it came close to the end of the Shemitah year, the seventh year, and they were worried that people would not be obligated to pay them back, so they wouldn't lend. So Hillel came up with something called the Pruzbul. The Pruzbul was that this law only applied to individuals, that only individuals that had lent money didn't have to get paid back, but if it was owned by, like, so to speak, the Beth Din, or like bigger, larger corporate entities, then the law didn't apply. So what he did, he instituted the Pruzbul, which basically meant that people would give over their money, all their debts, to the Beth Din. And then it would come the time, the end of the seventh year, they would say that any debts that are owed to me now belongs to Beth Din. And then the Beth Din would have the authority to go and ask for that money back, and reclaim that loan back. And this way people were still able to loan, because one of the fundamental principles of Judaism is that we had to loan. Okay? So it's a way that he got around it to make sure that people were never struggling and always had a way to take out a loan, an interest-free loan from their fellow Jews. There's so much more we could talk about Hillel, but I wanted to tell you a fascinating story before I conclude this idea. There's one last point that I wanted to really focus on, which is that he says, Umakarvan, the last words of the Mishna was these words. If you look on the screen for a second, he says over here, he says, draws one who loves the creatures, draws them close to the Torah. What does this mean? To love your creatures. Oev et habriot. He said, Oev shalom, you should love peace. First of all, he says he calls them creatures. Why does he call people creatures? He's telling us with that, it's a very important lesson. Sometimes you think a person, you say that person's a wilde chaya. You know what a wilde chaya is? A wild animal. They don't act. You know, my parents used to say that when I was misbehaving, du bist a wilde chaya. You're a wild animal. When a person is acting like an animal, you sometimes say, so some people, they always act like animals. That's just the way they don't act the way a person's supposed to act. And he says, even those people that just acting like a creature, like a creation of God, especially those people, you should treat them with love. Because he also learned out from Aaron. What did Aaron do? There was a famous statement about Aaron that when he saw people that weren't behaving properly, he wouldn't go and rebuke them. What would he do? He would go to them and he would befriend them and he would shower them with love. And then they would say to themselves, wow, Aaron is befriending me. If Aaron could befriend me, then he must think that I have good qualities, right? And that would cause them to want to improve themselves. Sometimes that's the greatest way, when you show a person that you trust them, that you believe in them. So that would cause that person to elevate themselves. So he said, love those people. And he also said that if you have to teach people, the greatest way to teach people is to first show them love. Like God, he first took us out of Egypt and only afterwards gave us the Torah. Only afterwards started teaching us. Moshe rebukes us only at the end of his life, after he had first conquered the other nations. First conquer, first to love. And last point is this. It says over here, "Umukarvan la Torah." This is a very controversial statement right over here. We could talk for probably a good hour just on these two words. Bring people back to the closer. People that are, so to speak, misbehaving, quote unquote, they're acting like just random creatures. Bring them close to the Torah. Now, the famous study is, why did it say, why didn't it say bring the Torah close to them? Why are you saying bring them close to the Torah? He's trying to teach us an important lesson. And that is that you could never, ever change the Torah. The Torah is not changeable. There was people historically that try to think that if people are going away from the ways of the Torah, we should adapt the Torah to them. We should make the Torah fit and more appealing to them. You know, take away this law, take away that law. And of course, that's how we know a religion like Christianity came away. It didn't work for the people. It couldn't evolve. So what do? They took away most of the laws, and then most people were able to connect to some of the ideas of the Torah. We know that the Reform movement, in particular, adapted that approach, where they brought people, they changed the Torah to make it fit and more kind of universal, humanistic to fit. So he teaches us, no, we can never do that. We're never allowed to, so to speak, dilute the Torah in any side of way. The Torah has to remain the Torah. The laws of the Torah stay in principle. They can never be changed. But we can find ways to make it more accessible for people. And that's the idea. We make the Torah more accessible for people, not change the Torah. I'll conclude with one last story before I take any other points. There's a story in connection to this where one of the great sages, one of the greatest sages, his name was Rabbi Meir. There was once a lady that was coming to his classes on Friday night. He would give a class after just at the beginning of Shabbos. And it usually would go for like half an hour or so, and then they would go back to his shul. So this lady was coming to his shul, to his class. And the one Friday, his shir went on for a few hours. And by the time the shir went, the lady came home, her Shabbat candles had already gone out. And her husband, who was not as, such a shir goer, so to speak, was really angry at her. Look, we're not going to even be able to have a proper Shabbos meal. I was waiting for you for so long, and you stayed listening to the rabbi for so long. Now look, the candles are even gone out. She says, you got two choices. Either I divorce you, says this man, or you go and you spit in the eye of Rabbi Meir. Now, Rabbi Meir was one of the great sages of the times, and she didn't know what to do. So the next day, Rabbi Meir had some type of prophecy, some type of like dream about it, and he found out about what this woman had been told. So the next day he announced, he said, I've got something in my eye, and whoever could spit in my eye and say certain words to help it cure, I'll give them a blessing. So she takes she seizes the opportunity, and she goes up to him and she spits in his eye. He says, do you know what to say? And she got all embarrassed that she's been trapped. She didn't know what to say. Okay, she says, okay, spit 7 times. And then you don't have to say anything. So she spits in his eye 7 times. And now he says, I know about what your husband has threatened you. Go back to your husband and say, you told me to spit in the rabbi's eye once. I spat in his eye 7 times. So obviously that helped the situation. She had shown the disrespect to the rabbi, that she had given too much respect to the rabbi. Anyway, afterwards, Rabbi Meir's students were appalled that he was disrespected in such a strong way. So they asked their rabbi, what well, like, what were you thinking? Why did you allow yourself to be disrespected in such a strong way? He said, I would rather be disrespected again and again, not to break up the marriage of a husband and wife, not to cause anything to come between a man and his woman. It's a very powerful story. We know that one of the greatest women in the Talmudic and Mishnaic eras was actually the wife of Rabbi Meir. Her name was Bruria, and one day we will have a little bit of discussion about her. A very, very interesting woman, but definitely had a good marriage with her. So, okay, that's the conclusion of our lesson. I suppose today's lesson is all about finding ways to make peace and sticking to
Rabbi,
Yes.
can I ask you, why is that rabbi supporting a marriage where the husband is abusive towards the woman?
Why is the rabbi? I hear the question. It's a good question. I think it's. I don't know the details of the story. It's more with me. It's more important is the lesson of the story of what he was trying to teach. The rabbi obviously acknowledged that this man was really upset and felt that she had kind of cheated at him by spending so much time when her family was waiting for her to celebrate Shabbos, to commemorate Shabbos, to do the Shabbos meal. And the rabbi didn't necessarily think of her in that way. I don't think he thought of it. Well, of course, it was not the right thing to do, and the Rabbi Meir was not encouraging the abuse, so to speak, of the husband. That's not what he was trying to do. But he was trying to teach a lesson of the importance of not doing things that would come in the way of a marriage. I think the story is also bringing out that what the husband did was wrong, and said was wrong. But at the same time, there's space to understand where he was coming from. You know, he wasn't himself a person that had much respect for that rabbi, and he felt that his wife had given too much respect to her. But I hear your point. I don't have a proper answer, but it's not exactly the point that I was trying to bring out. So I don't have a proper answer to your question.
Okay, I have another question.
Yeah.
You're allowed to lie in particular situations. Now, the black and white situations are clear. Don't lie to the police or whatever. Where do you know where the gray areas line is? I mean, some people will take advantage of you're allowed to lie while they're not. So where's the line in the green area, in the gray area?
That's a good question. It's a topic unto itself, which is when there's the halacha. Actually, Shulchan Aruch does actually talk about this, about the concept of lying, and I can't tell you that I could remember all of it on the top of my head. I think I did once actually, quite a few years ago, give a share on this exact topic, more focusing on the lie. And I think over there it does, from the best of my memory, it does give some qualifications in saying that generally a lie is always forbidden. But if the lie is what's going to help you to get to a greater truth, that's when it's permissible. Obviously, if you're talking about a situation where by lying you're helping a husband and wife come together or people make peace, there could be space for it. But afterwards, in other words, in the case of Aaron, he didn't consider a lie because he saw that it was actually the truth. But it wasn't the truth that they had said it was truth that was the way the person was really feeling. When it comes to other cases, I think that's where it's really important to have an outside objective view from somebody to find out, is it okay to lie in such a circumstance? There was definitely, we know that when it comes to, for example, saving somebody's life, without a question, you're allowed to lie to save somebody's life. There's a fascinating story that when the Rebbe and Rebbetzin were running away, the Lubavitcher Rebbe were running away from the Nazis. They were in, I think it was in Nice, in France, and the Nazis sent around the police to go around from house to house asking people what religion they were, before they had done a full occupation rounded up all the Jews, and they knew that there was lots of Jewish refugees hiding around. So when they came to the house of the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, and they had escaped Tunis, the Rebbe at the time was not yet the Rebbe; he was just married to the previous Rebbe's daughter. The Rebbetzin was home. Anyway, the Rebbetzin came home. So when the Rebbe came home, the Rebbetzin told him that you should know that the Nazis came and asked what my religion was. So I said Orthodoxy, and they accepted it. And they basically, she said, well, I didn't lie. I said, we're Orthodox. And they took me as being Orthodox Christians. And I meant, I meant Orthodox Jews, but I don't want to say Jewish. So the Rebbe said, I don't want to have anywhere written down, even for one moment, that I'm not Jewish. I don't care what it is. I will not think. And he went back. He says, I'm going to go back to them and tell them that I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm a Jew. So he didn't want to. But by the way, we know from this past week's portion, when Yaakov steals the blessings, if Yaakov wouldn't have stolen those blessings, the way he stole the blessings is he didn't lie, but he did trick. What did he say? He said, "Are you Esav, my firstborn?" What did he answer? I. He said, I am I. He just said I, and then he says, Esav is your firstborn. But the way he wanted Yitzchak to understand it, to say that I am Esav, your firstborn, but he didn't say that. He said, Esav is your firstborn. But Yitzchak understood him to be saying that. So therefore, Yaakov was not willing to lie. Would he have been willing to lie in such circumstances? Probably. But he did not actually lie. Did he trick his father into understanding him differently? Yes. So there's numerous cases in Torah where we have places where the benefits of lying outweigh the telling the truth is not going to help you. So it's like, as I say, it's a whole question unto itself. It's a whole big topic. The general thing is that there are guidelines within halacha when we should. Obviously, when by telling the truth, you'll be causing more damage to people. You could be putting other people in jeopardy. And by the way, putting people in jeopardy includes putting marriages in jeopardy. That's considered life-threatening from a Jewish perspective. Putting people's jobs at times in jeopardy could also be considered a life-threatening situation from Jewish law. And embarrassing people could also be considered.
When are you going to be able to sit down with me and talk about that?
It's never black and it's never that
summary.
It's never that black and white in that regard, right? So the answer to your question is, how do you know? It's about getting good. It's about getting good advice from objective sources, preferably a halachic source. Okay, it's a big question that you ask. All right, any other questions, arguments, debates? All right, I wanted to dedicate, Shelley, I was meaning to dedicate today's shir in honor of Karen Bashena, whose yahrzeit was on Sunday, or for the honor of her, that's Shelley's daughter's yahrzeit was on Sunday. So today's shir was dedicated in her honor, and also dedicated in honor and memory of another person that sometimes joins our shir, which is Peter's wife, and her yahrzeit is on Shabbos. So that's Sarah Bas Aaron. So in the memory, in the merit of all our Torah learning of all of us, please God, their souls should have an aliyah, an elevation.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll see you again.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.